Hello, good morning. So the session of today will be about mobility and pastoralism. Mobility, why is it so important in general, and why is it so relevant when it comes to pastoralism and to pastoral people? I will start the presentation by framing somehow the debate around the issue of being on the move, talking then about the shift from movement to mobility and some historical pieces of that. Then we will go through geography with some examples drawn from pastoral settings, and then we will discuss about the implications specifically for pastors in conceptual as well as methodological terms. What are we talking about? Movement. Movement is basically the relationship between something, space and time. Something that moves from a location in space, A, to another one, B, in a different moment of time. And this kind of thing could be livestock, could be people, could be goods, information, services, money, could be very many different things. And they can move from one place to another, from one moment to another. That is the basic of movement. And there are very many ways of defining movement. Can be geographical movement, can be vertical movement or social movement when it comes to people aspiring to move from one class to another in the social structure. Or it could be digital if it's done through internet or through computers. So there are very many different ways of thinking about mobility and very many different ways of looking at mobility or movement in this moment. Then, as we can see, this kind of movement can be not just linear, as we normally think about. The movement from A to B could be done in very many different ways. And very often there are very interesting reasons behind the ways people move or livestock move, as we will see. A bit of history in order to trace back the reasons for this debate. According to literature and from what I also believe, in the Western culture there's been two major movements in time when the idea of movement became central into our culture. They were both around the 16th century. One was Galileo Galilei, that somehow understood or discovered, as we want to say, that the Earth was not at the center of the universe. It was just one small, tiny, little something moving, rotating on its own and moving around some other stars and planets. So the idea that the Earth, humankind and human being were at the center of the universe disappeared. We are just a small tiny part that moves in a system that is much more complex and complicated, that is the universe. So Galileo, he's a physician, and through astronomical studies he came up with the idea that movement is not something wrong in nature, it's not something that happens by accident, but it is in the nature of things. On the opposite, when something does not move, then there is something happening there. I mean, that is the result of an accident. The nature of things is moving somehow, as much as for the Earth. And then Cristoforo Colombo, that somehow, he went and he conquered the Americas, and therefore he opened up somehow the globe, the world, to traveling, trading, and moving around. So basically showing that through movement, the whole world was at reach somehow. And in the last centuries, if you think about the technological development we've gone through, mechanical as well as electronical, we see that most of these technological advancements, they've been enhancing movement of things. Think about the mail system, the railway, the planes, cars, and more recently satellites, internet, and mobile phones. They all push for moving information, people, money, and commodities one way and the other of the world. So movement became and becomes and still is somehow central to our society. That is when and why somehow in the 90s there was this so-called mobility turn. It was understood in social sciences that there was something missing in the way we're looking at movement. There was a part of the story that was not yet properly told. Because the debate was about movement, that, as we've seen, is a physical something from A to B in space and time, very, very physical, very much bounded to material relations. But there's a whole aspect that deals with the socio-cultural and political implications of movement. And this is what is somehow the mobility debate. that parallel to the material move, there is something else that enables, makes that possible, or constrains, or pose problems, or provides opportunity in terms of decision-making, capability, rights, cost, and everything else. There is somehow the social, I would call it the socio-political infrastructure associated to movement. And that is what I call mobility. So there is movement and mobility, and they go together. I mean, they are part of the same process, but they belong to different dimensions. And by the way, the word mobility that has been so much out of date for so long, that was when we will come back to pastoral areas, we will see how mobility has been seen as something archaic to disappear soon. It became from something archaeological to something postmodern. So nowadays, most of the debates is about nomadism and traveling, and even traffic nowadays is one of the indicators of development, unfortunately. So mobility is definitely a central part of our culture and of our society nowadays. What does it mean? This kind of redefinition of time and space bring some implications and some challenging implications that go along with that. There are socio-political implications. There's a transformation of social life, as we've seen. Conceptual implications, because when we think about a household or a community or a citizen, if you think about mobility and people and things moving one way and the other, it's much more complicated to frame the concept of household, community, and citizen, amongst others. And there are also some kind of methodological challenges, because when social sciences put mobility at the center of its inquiry, somehow the perspective of everything else changes as well. There are changes in the relationships, in the values, in the knowledge, so on and so forth. So we have to somehow recombine and redefine our way of looking at things. This was the idea, I would say, the conceptual and methodological implications of the mobility term. Let's now, from history, let's go back to geography, and let's come back to our pastoral areas. Why is it mobility so relevant and so important in pastoral areas and when looking at pastoral people? We know that mobility is relevant for people and livestock to trace and track resources that are somehow scarce and variable in time and space. So it fits very well with this movement and mobility perspective. And mobility in pastoral areas means an articulation that changes from one place to another, one period to another, between livestock, land, and labor. So the household and the herd, the way they define themselves vis-a-vis the landscape, the territory, the natural resources. And as we know, there are different patterns, and there's a specific classification for that. We talk about nomadic or opportunistic movement, when the herd follow the clouds and opportunistically move where the rainfall was and the good grazing is. Or we talk about transhuman patterns, where there is somehow circular mobility, where the herd move from one season in one place and another season in another place, and these two places, they show some kind of ecological complementarity. We talk about agro-pastoral or semi-sedentary or other forms of mobility, when one part of the year is devoted to kinds of farming or agriculture, some agricultural practice, and therefore the family, at least part of the household, is associated to a specific place in time in order to take care of the farming practices. And there are other ways, I will not go into, there are other patterns, other ways, I will not go into too many details, but just to mention that there's always been this dichotomy between farming, sedentary communities and mobile, crazy pastoralists. No? This has been very often the dichotomy, like an opposition of the two terms, whereas we know that there's a continuum of people that move one season, move another season, even agriculture people, they might be mobile during some season, so it's not necessarily something associated to pastoralism. It's a continuum of practices that involve different forms of mobility. And what is interesting is that in most of the literature, since I think last century, 2 centuries ago, the idea was that the mobility embedded into pastoral system was a kind of cultural remnant that was just waiting to disappear. Sooner or later, this movement would have just stopped, as it would have been the case for hunters and gatherers and all these kind of historical moves. We know that mobility is still very much a part of pastoralism, though it has shifted. It has shifted because the society has shifted, the opportunities are different, the capacities to move or not to move have changed. So we now have different forms, as we've seen in our regional analysis. Inverse mobility, whereas the animals don't move so much, but it is through trucks that fodder and water is brought to the animals, and possibly it is through motorbikes that milk is taken out from the animals to the market. So it's through mechanization that the animals don't move and everything else move around them. We have seen forms of boxed-in mobility, meaning that due to administrative or national boundaries, the pastoralists and the herders, they are just boxed in because they can't move the way they would have liked because they have no access to land, or they have no right, or they have no capacity. We've also seen some forms of substitutional mobility, whereby pastoral people that immigrated sent back the money in order for somebody else to take care of their flock through hiring herders and so on. So it is still pastoralism with different forms of mobility, people going out for immigration one side and coming in through immigration as hired herders on the other side. We've seen forms of partial mobility, when part of the family stay closer to the urban areas in order to have better access to services, whereas the other part moves. So it's been changing, but it's still definitely there. It's been changing because mobile phones are available, networks are there, trucks and radios are quite performing in most of the areas. So there are other forms of mobility. You don't necessarily need to move yourself in order to send an information. There's a telephone. So mobility is still there in different forms. And once more, I go back to the point that there are different ways of moving nowadays and different ways of looking at mobility, at framing mobility. Let's take two examples. One is from both from sub-Saharan Africa. One is from the western flank. In the Sahel, we know about the process of the practice of the transhumance that move people and animal from the northbound to the southbound of the Sahelian region, one season and the other. And we know there are very many different reasons for that. And there are very many ways of moving and very many ways of looking at this movement. You can understand these transhumance as driven, somehow triggered by ecological factors, such as the rainfall gradient. So animal and people, people move the animals in order to make use of the best grazing in each different season, and therefore they go south and north depending on the rainfall gradient and the season. But there could also be a more economic perspective, where it's not the rainfall gradient, but it's the prices in the market of livestock that make people move in one season and the other. We know that the southern part of the coastal area is highly demanding animal proteins, and therefore there might be a major economic trigger in moving animals that direction during a part of the year. One other way of looking at that would be the social landscapes that are present somehow somewhere in the Sahel, and therefore people moving according to networks of or ethnic belonging, ethnical territories, so on and so forth. So these are three ways of looking at the same process, and very often what happens is that the three ways, they are all consistent, and that kind of mobility is a kind of multidimensional mobility, where all these three dimensions and even more possibly are simultaneously interconnected. So they move because of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. And then depends on the way you look at it, where you put your focus, where you put your lens. From that, you will understand more or less which is the most relevant of these processes in your opinion and in your perspective. So the way you look at things is very much a criteria to define what you will be looking at. Think about the fact that while moving with this animal, a herder might be sending messages through an SMS to some mates in the surrounding and sell animals in local markets at the same time. So you have the three dimensions overlapping in one single moment in time. So different forms of mobility and different ways of looking at mobility. Another example is drawn from the other side of the sub-Saharan belt, from northern Somalia. Once more, the issue of camel milk marketing, and my understanding was that when you look at the Somali ecosystem, as it is called, on this side of the map, on this side of the slide, you have this map, whereas the Somali ecosystem is a territory whereby the agroecological and the sociocultural elements are very much homogeneous. Same people, same culture, very similar climate, I would say, similar vegetation, although with different opportunities, because the inland is definitely different from the coastal line, but very much the same Somali ecosystem, inhabited by the same people, though it is split into 4 different countries and all the political divides. When you go into a deeper detail and you look at how this ecosystem is managed and is governed, you understand that most of the movements through these territories take place through what I call corridors. And corridors are the superimposition of 2 parallel dimensions. There is a territorial, physical dimension whereby you have water points, grazing areas, small markets, urban centers, and everything else. And parallel to that, there is a whole institutional setting, what I would say a kind of socio-political infrastructure that enables the functioning of these corridors. And one without the other would not make the system very, very efficient. So you have people moving because you have a system that enables them to be secure, to get credit, to find money, to get access to water, to find the right market in the right moment. So just secure those kind of movement that are not by definition so easy in any other case. So there are 2 layers that we have to look at, the physical one plus the socio-cultural and political one. And I insist on the fact that I think one would not be efficient without the other. So, coming back from these 2 examples, what I wanted to highlight is somehow that very much the visions, what you see depends very much on what you look at. So, the lens you put on is what you will be able to see. I also wanted to highlight the relevance of assessing physical as well as socio-political infrastructure, so looking at both dimensions, the material and the socio-cultural and socio-political, as you like. And the third point is the centrality of the territorial articulation and the functioning of network. A territory is very often interpreted to a number of relationships that are not just between people and physical assets, but it's also between people from different groups and in different areas. So that there are networks that regulate and enable the management and the governance of the resources in the landscape. So the point is that when I think about mobility and the relevance that through the mobility turn we are trying, the relevance of mobility in the debate and the challenges that are brought by the mobility turn to social sciences, I was wondering, when looking at pastoral areas, where can we find some good advice? Where can we find some good alliances or partnership? To whom can we ask some suggestion or some kind of collaboration? And I thought that looking at people dealing with migration studies, we could have found an interesting constituency, an interesting domain where we could have learned something, where we could have found materials to fill out our toolbox. Because if we look at pastoral mobility, the way it's conceived in literature is very often referring to just nomadic, transhumant, very, very static and very mechanical somehow way of looking at pastoral movement. But when we bring in the challenge of mobility being at the center of our analysis, there is something missing in the literature, as I noted. So the idea is to look for these new tools and these new instruments, and ideally in migration studies we have the opportunity and the chance to forge new elements that would help us in our understanding of pastoral mobilities.
Good morning.
Just to give you some example, there's been, through migration studies, we've been able to somehow fluidify the debate from being so mechanicistical, from push and pull factors, origin and destination, believing now that migration is a kind of translocational process where people, they don't necessarily stop in one place, but they might stop in one place for some time and then move to another place. So there are new dimensions that are brought into the picture. There's the concept of agency, very much so people decide to move according to their capacities, their capabilities, their networks, and other things. The idea of networks is very much part of this debate. So the fact is that through migration studies, we might be able to find and forge new elements, as well as new alliances that might help our analysis of mobility in pastoral areas. I tried myself to engage into this endeavor, and I wrote a project that was eventually a project that was eventually funded in 2014, where I tried to mix migration studies with pastoral mobility. And the idea was looking at the presence and the relevance of migrant shepherds in Southern Europe. And therefore, in Spain, Italy, France, and Greece, there's a high number of people coming from Macedonia, Morocco, Romania, and Albania coming to work as shepherds. So the idea was to try to mix the two different forms of mobility and see what was coming up at the end of the story. And the basic understanding I got, just in 3 short lines, 3 main findings, is that this kind of migration is not new. It's been there for centuries. It's been there for at least the last 3 centuries, as it is somehow reported in literature. People going from Italy to France, people moving from southern part of Spain to northern part of Spain, people moving from the Kurdistan to the western areas of Turkey, people moving all over around the Mediterranean region in order to somehow come and provide pastoral labor to different regions. So there's been a kind of substitutional change, a generational change with some substitution of ethnic groups in some areas for the last centuries. So this process of having migrants coming to play as shepherds in certain areas was not new for the Mediterranean. That was the first major finding. A second one was an interesting one, is that shepherding can be considered as a skill, as a labor skill that could be imagined in the job market as one way of selling yourself into the international labor market, and therefore gives you the opportunity to move from one region and one country to another because of your shepherding skills. And the third point that somehow is relevant for the sector is that we've seen this kind of geographical mobility, meaning that people were able to move from one country to another, but because of a number of administrative, bureaucratic, financial, and social problems, many of these shepherds, they've not been able to integrate properly and to scale up eventually in the social scale. So they started as shepherds, and 20 years later they were still shepherds. They have not been able to accumulate livestock, to accumulate money, to buy land, to set up their own enterprise. So they've not been able to scale up socially. So the vertical mobility has not taken over. That was the case in the previous generations when people moving from other areas came, like the Italian people that from Piemonte went to France. The second generation, they were not just shepherds, they were livestock owners. And if you go to the southern part of France nowadays, in Provence, 40% about of the livestock owners, they have an Italian name because they are the nephews and the grandchildren of those that came in the late 19th century to work as shepherds. This process is not there because there's an inconsistency between the geographical mobility of people and their capacity to apply forms of social mobility. And this is relevant because it's affecting the generational renewal of the sector in the Mediterranean, and therefore it's affecting its kind of sustainability in the longer term. So this is just one example to show how it could be useful and fruitful to apply elements of migration studies to understand mobilities in pastoral areas. I thank you very much for your attention, and here are the credits for the pictures and the maps.